What's up, everyone? Before we dive into one of the most chaotic, legally complicated, and surprisingly unromantic events in medieval history, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Trust me, after you hear what medieval weddings were really like, you'll be grateful for modern wedding planners, divorce lawyers, and the concept of marrying for love. Let's get into it. Picture this. You're getting married in medieval Europe. Congratulations. Except you've probably never met your spouse before today. Your entire extended family is watching to make sure you consummate the marriage properly. The ceremony might happen in a barn, and if you're lucky enough to be nobility, there's a decent chance this wedding is happening to prevent a war. Oh, and that romantic white dress? That's about 400 years away from being invented. Welcome to medieval matrimony, where love is optional, alliances are mandatory, and your wedding night has witnesses. Today, we're diving deep into what weddings were actually like in the Middle Ages, and spoiler alert, they were nothing like the Pinterest boards and fairy tales would have you believe. We're talking arranged marriages negotiated like livestock trades, wedding ceremonies that could happen literally anywhere, including taverns and wheat fields, consummation rituals that would make modern people file restraining orders, and enough legal complexity to make your head spin. From the betrothal negotiations that started when you were still a child, to the morning after gifts that proved you'd done your marital duty, we're covering it all. So grab your metaphorical dowry, practice your contractually obligated vows, and let's explore why you absolutely wouldn't survive getting married in medieval times. And more importantly, why the entire institution of medieval marriage was designed around everything except your personal happiness. Chapter 1. The betrothal, when your marriage got decided before you could walk. Let's start at the very beginning, which in medieval terms means starting when you're somewhere between just learned to talk and haven't hit puberty yet. Because in medieval Europe, particularly among the nobility and merchant classes, betrothals often happened when the bride and groom were children. And we're not talking teenagers. We're talking actual children. 7, 8, 9 years old, sometimes younger. These weren't casual promises either. A betrothal was legally binding, essentially a pre-marriage that created obligations almost as serious as marriage itself. Once you were betrothed, you couldn't just change your mind because you met someone cuter at the harvest festival. Breaking a betrothal required papal dispensation, massive legal proceedings, or in some cases, starting a minor war. The betrothal ceremony itself was surprisingly formal for something involving people who still believed in the tooth fairy. The families would gather, usually with a priest present, though this wasn't strictly required in the early medieval period. The children, or rather their fathers speaking for them, would exchange vows of future consent. "I will take you as my husband when we're old enough," was basically the formula. Rings might be exchanged, usually placed on the right hand to distinguish from actual marriage rings which went on the left. Then came the fun part, the contract negotiations. And when I say fun, I mean the opposite of fun. I mean hours, sometimes days, of two families arguing over dowries, dower rights, land transfers, inheritance clauses, and what happens if one party dies before the actual wedding. Medieval marriage contracts made modern prenuptial agreements look like grocery lists. The bride's family had to provide a dowry. This could be money, land, livestock, household goods, or some combination thereof. For peasants, a dowry might be a cow, some chickens, a few pieces of cloth, and maybe a cooking pot if the family was feeling generous. For nobility, we're talking estates, titles, trade rights, and enough gold to fund a small army. The dowry wasn't a gift to the groom exactly. It was meant to support the wife during marriage and revert to her if she was widowed, though in practice husbands often controlled it entirely. Meanwhile, the groom's family had to guarantee the dower, also called the morning gift in some regions. This was property or money set aside for the bride that she would receive after the marriage was consummated, Yes, you read that right. The morning gift was literally payment for spending the wedding night with your husband. Romance was truly dead, or more accurately, had never been born. But here's where it gets complicated. The betrothal created a state of quasi-marriage. Betrothed couples were expected to remain faithful to each other, even though they might not actually wed for another decade. If a betrothed woman was caught with another man, it could be treated as adultery. If the betrothed man fathered children with someone else, those children were illegitimate and had no inheritance rights, even though the actual marriage hadn't happened yet. Some betrothals included cohabitation agreements. The future bride might be sent to live with her future husband's family, essentially becoming an unpaid servant while waiting to be old enough to marry. She'd learn the household routines, build relationships with her future in-laws who may or may not resent her presence, and generally prepare for her role as wife. Fun times for a 10-year-old who just wanted to play with dolls. The church had opinions about all this, naturally. Canon law technically set minimum ages for marriage, 12 for girls, 14 for boys. But betrothals could happen earlier, and they frequently did. The church tried to require parental consent for betrothals, then tried to require the consent of the betrothed parties themselves, then mostly gave up and accepted that noble families were going to do whatever served their political interests. There were loopholes, though. If you were betrothed as a child, you could theoretically refuse to go through with the marriage when you reached the age of consent. This was called repudiation, and it required you to make a formal declaration, usually before witnesses, and ideally before a church official. In practice, actually following through with repudiation, if you were a young noblewoman with zero legal rights and a father who'd already spent your dowry, was nearly impossible. But it happened occasionally. Records survive of young people, particularly young noblewomen, who stood before bishops and announced they would not honour betrothals arranged in childhood. Some succeeded in breaking their contracts. Others were pressured, threatened, or in extreme cases, physically forced into going through with the marriage anyway. Medieval family values in action. For peasants, betrothals were less formal, but betrothals still serious. A promise of marriage, especially if made before witnesses, was considered binding in most communities. If a young man promised to marry a young woman, then backed out after they'd been intimate, that was a scandal that could result in fines, forced marriage, or the young man being run out of town by angry relatives with pitchforks. Then there was the issue of consanguinity, which is a fancy church word for you're too closely related to marry. The church prohibited marriage within 7 degrees of kinship, which sounds reasonable until you realize that in medieval villages, where everyone was related to everyone else going back generations, this made finding an acceptable spouse nearly impossible. Eventually the church reduced it to 4 degrees, then later to 3, because even bishops recognized that being too strict would result in nobody getting married at all. Dispensations for consanguinity could be purchased, naturally, if you were wealthy enough and the marriage was politically important enough. A bishop or even the Pope could grant special permission for cousins to marry. This happened constantly among royalty, where the pool of acceptable spouses was tiny and alliances mattered more than genetic diversity. So, before you even got to the actual wedding, you'd already navigated childhood betrothals, contract negotiations complex enough to require lawyers, family politics that made Christmas dinner look peaceful, and church regulations that seemed designed to make everyone's life harder. And we haven't even gotten to the ceremony yet. Chapter 2. Pre-wedding negotiations, the part where your marriage became a legal circus. So you've survived your betrothal, you've reached the minimum age for marriage, and your families have decided it's finally time to seal the deal. Fantastic. Now comes the really fun part, the pre-wedding negotiations, where every single detail of your married life gets hammered out by people who are not you, in contracts you probably can't read, enforced by laws you definitely don't understand. First up, finalising the financial arrangements. Remember that dowry we mentioned? Time to actually hand it over, which was rarely as simple as writing a cheque. If the dowry included land, there needed to be surveys, title transfers, and verification that the land in question actually existed and wasn't, say, currently occupied by a rival noble family who disagreed about ownership. If it included livestock, someone had to physically transport cows and sheep from one estate to another, hoping they didn't die along the way or get stolen by bandits. Medieval accountants earned their keep during wedding negotiations. Every item had to be listed, valued, and recorded in duplicate or triplicate. Disputes were common. You promised 20 sheep, but these are clearly goats. The contract says fertile farmland, not this swamp. Half these coins are clipped. Do you think I'm stupid? Families could spend months arguing over whether a promised tapestry was valuable enough, or if the silver plate was actually silver or just really shiny tin. For nobility, marriage contracts could run dozens of pages. They'd specify not just dowry and dower, but inheritance rights for future children, widow's portions if the husband died, widower's rights if the wife died first, custody arrangements for children in case of death or annulment, and provisions for what happened if the marriage produced no heirs. These contracts anticipated every possible disaster, which tells you something about how optimistic medieval people were about marriage. The dower had to be formally assigned. The groom's family would designate specific properties or income sources that would support the bride if she became a widow. This was called dower land, and it was legally protected. Even if the husband went bankrupt, got declared a traitor, or lost everything gambling on jousting tournaments, the wife's dower was supposed to remain untouchable. In practice, this protection was only as good as the local lord's willingness to enforce it. Then came marriage portions for younger children. If you were a noble family marrying off your eldest son, you had to ensure younger sons and daughters would still receive something. Marriage contracts often included provisions like, the second son receives the manor of X, or daughters receive 100 marks each upon their own marriages. This could get incredibly complex in families with 8 or 10 children, all of whom had inheritance expectations and none of whom wanted to become penniless monks or nuns. Peasant marriages were simpler, but still involved negotiation. The bride's family might promise a few acres of land, some farm equipment, household goods, and maybe a small amount of coin. The groom's family would guarantee she'd have a place to live and support if he died. Local custom dictated most of these arrangements, and the village community often served as witnesses and enforcers. But here's a fun complication. Different regions had different marriage customs. In some parts of Europe, wives retained complete control over their dowries. In others, husbands gained total control upon marriage. Some regions practiced community property, where everything acquired during marriage belonged to both spouses equally. Others kept property strictly separate, and if you married someone from a different region or kingdom, good luck figuring out which legal system applied. The church inserted itself into negotiations too. Marriage bans had to be published, announced publicly in church for 3 consecutive Sundays before the wedding. This gave anyone who knew of an impediment to the marriage, prior betrothal, hidden consanguinity, secret vows of celibacy, the chance to come forward. In theory, this prevented invalid marriages. In practice, it gave nosy neighbours and jealous rivals the opportunity to cause trouble. Sometimes legitimate impediments surfaced. Actually, the groom is already married to my cousin in another county. The bride took a private vow of chastity when she was 15. They're second cousins, I can prove it. When this happened, the wedding was postponed while church officials investigated. These investigations could take months and sometimes revealed genuinely awkward facts. More often, bans were a formality that everyone ignored. If you were powerful enough, you could get them waived entirely. Royal marriages frequently skipped bans because announcing the marriage too far in advance gave rival kingdoms time to sabotage the alliance. Speed and secrecy sometimes trumped proper procedure. Legal representatives got involved for important marriages. Families hired advocates, basically medieval lawyers, to review contracts and protect their interests. These advocates would argue over clause wording, negotiate compromises, and occasionally discover that the other family was trying to slip in provisions like the bride's family also agrees to support the groom's elderly mother, 3 unmarried sisters, and a ne'er-do-well brother indefinitely. Surprise clauses were apparently a medieval thing too. Foreign marriages required even more complexity. If a princess was marrying a prince from another kingdom, you'd need translators for the contracts, diplomats to negotiate terms, and usually hostages or guarantees to ensure both sides honoured the agreement. These weddings were diplomatic events with treaties attached. The bride and groom were essentially human collateral in international politics. And finally, someone had to organise the actual wedding celebration, which was its own negotiation nightmare. Who pays for the feast? How many guests? Where does it happen? How long does the celebration last? For nobility, weddings could involve hundreds of guests, multiple days of feasting, tournaments and entertainment expensive enough to bankrupt smaller estates. Families argued over every detail because whoever hosted the wedding gained social prestige, but also the crushing expense. All of this happened before anyone said, "I do." Before the ceremony, before the feast, before the wedding night, that we'll get to later, and that you're definitely not ready for. Medieval marriage started as a business transaction that happened to involve 2 people who might have to spend the rest of their lives together. Romantic, right? Chapter 3. The Wedding Ceremony. Less church, more chaos. Now we finally arrive at the actual wedding ceremony, and here's your first surprise. It probably didn't happen in a church. For most of the medieval period, weddings took place wherever was convenient. The village square, someone's home, the church porch. Note, the porch, not inside. A random field, sometimes even taverns. The ceremony was more about public witnessing than religious ritual. That's because for much of the Middle Ages, marriage was considered a secular contract rather than a religious sacrament. The church only gradually took control of marriage, and even then, couples could legally marry with or without a priest. All you really needed was consent from both parties and witnesses. That's it. No formal ceremony required, which meant couples could and did marry themselves in all sorts of creative locations. The actual ceremony was shockingly brief. If a priest was present, he'd ask both parties if they consented. The groom would say, "I take you as my wife." The bride would say, "I take you as my husband." Maybe they'd exchange rings. Done. Total time, maybe 5 minutes. There were no long sermons, no elaborate rituals, no readings from scripture. Those came later in the mass that might follow, but the actual marriage part was over before you could blink. Let's talk about those vows. They weren't the romantic promises we're used to today. Medieval marriage vows were essentially legal contracts, spoken aloud. The groom would promise to take the woman as his wife, to have and to hold from this day forward. The bride would promise to be bonny and buxom in bed and at board, which meant obedient and cheerful in the bedroom and at the table. Yes, really, medieval romance at its finest. In some regions, the vows included specific property provisions. "I endow you with all my worldly goods" wasn't romantic, it was literal. The groom was making a legal declaration about property rights, sometimes while physically handing over symbolic items like a ring, coins, or even a piece of turf representing land. The ring ceremony had its own symbolism. Rings weren't always used, particularly among peasants who couldn't afford them. When they were, the groom would place the ring on the bride's right hand first, then move it across several fingers while invoking the Trinity, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, before finally placing it on the left ring finger, where a vein supposedly ran directly to the heart. This belief was anatomically wrong but romantically persistent. Witnesses were absolutely crucial. Medieval marriage depended on community recognition. A couple needed witnesses to testify that consent was freely given and that the ceremony actually happened. Without witnesses, the marriage could be challenged or even annulled later. So weddings were deliberately public events, with neighbours, friends and family members all present to serve as legal proof. This public nature meant weddings were community events, whether the couple wanted them to be or not. Your entire village might show up uninvited because they had a vested interest in knowing who was married to whom. This affected inheritance, land rights, feudal obligations, and local politics. Plus, medieval people loved any excuse for a celebration. Church porches were popular wedding locations because they satisfied both secular and religious requirements. The legal contract happened on the porch, witnessed by the community. Then everyone would file into the church for a nuptial mass to get God's blessing on the union. This way, you'd covered both the law and the Lord. But plenty of weddings happened with no church involvement whatsoever. A couple could exchange vows in front of witnesses anywhere, anytime, and be legally married. These were called clandestine marriages, and the church hated them because they were impossible to regulate. But they were valid, at least until the Council of Trent in 1563 finally required priest and witnesses for all Catholic marriages. The problem with clandestine marriages was verification. If a couple secretly married, then later one party denied it ever happened, how could you prove it? This led to endless legal disputes. We exchanged vows in the barn 6 months ago. No, we didn't. I was just being friendly. Witnesses helped, but if the marriage was secret, there weren't any. Church courts spent enormous amounts of time sorting out he said, she said marriage disputes. Some couples exploited this ambiguity deliberately. A nobleman might secretly marry a lower-class woman, keep it hidden, then publicly marry a noble woman arranged by his family. Later, if the second marriage proved inconvenient, he could reveal the first marriage and get the second annulled. The church tried to prevent this by requiring bans and public ceremonies, but it kept happening anyway. Peasant weddings were straightforward affairs. The couple would gather at the church porch or village centre on a Sunday morning after Mass. The village priest would ask for consent, maybe say a prayer, and that was that. Afterward, there might be a small celebration, modest feast, maybe some dancing, but nothing elaborate. Then everyone went back to work because crops didn't harvest themselves. Noble weddings were spectacles. These could last multiple days and include tournaments, theatrical performances, elaborate feasts, and enough political posturing to exhaust everyone involved. The ceremony itself was still relatively simple, but it was wrapped in layers of pageantry designed to display wealth and power. Royal weddings were international events. When a king married, foreign ambassadors attended, treaties were signed, and the ceremony became a statement of political alliance. The bride might wear cloth of gold, arrive in a procession of hundreds, and exchange vows under canopies embroidered with both families' coats of arms. The message wasn't, these two people love each other. It was, these two kingdoms are now allied, and we're rich enough to prove it. Wedding attire varied wildly. Peasant brides wore their best dress, usually just their nicest regular clothes in practical colours like brown, green or blue. Wealthy brides might wear elaborate gowns in expensive colours like red, purple or gold. White didn't become standard until much later. In fact, wearing white to a medieval wedding would have seemed odd, white being expensive to maintain and impractical for future use. The groom's attire was similarly practical. Peasants wore their best tunics and hose. Nobles wore fashionable clothing that displayed their wealth, fancy fabrics, fur trim, gold buttons, the works. The point was to look prosperous, not necessarily romantic. Music was common at weddings when people could afford it. Travelling musicians might be hired to play during the ceremony and feast. Popular wedding songs celebrated fertility, prosperity, and occasionally made jokes that would be considered wildly inappropriate today. Medieval humour was not subtle, and then, once the brief ceremony concluded and everyone had witnessed the exchange of vows, the real festivities began. The wedding feast, where things got messy, expensive, and occasionally violent. But we'll get to that. Chapter 4. The Wedding Feast, where things got expensive and awkward. Congratulations, you're married. Now comes the part where your families try to outdo each other in hospitality while simultaneously bankrupting themselves. The wedding feast. And when medieval people threw a feast, they didn't mess around. We're talking multiple courses, whole roasted animals, enough alcohol to float a ship, and entertainment that ranged from amusing to absolutely unhinged. For wealthy families, the wedding feast was a social necessity and a financial disaster waiting to happen. Noble weddings could host hundreds of guests, sometimes over 1,000 for royal occasions. Each guest expected to be fed lavishly, entertained constantly, and sent home with gifts. The cost could equal years of estate income. The feast typically happened immediately after the ceremony, starting around midday and continuing until late evening, or even the next morning. Guests would gather in the Great Hall if you had one, otherwise in the largest available space, a barn, a courtyard, anywhere that could fit tables and benches for the assembled multitude. Seating arrangements were a political minefield. Medieval society was obsessed with hierarchy, and where you sat at the wedding feast announced your social status to everyone present. The high table, where the bride, groom, and most important guests sat, was elevated and positioned prominently. Everyone else was seated in descending order of importance, with the least important guests crammed together near the door where the drafts were worst and the service slowest. People fought over seating. Nobles would arrive early to secure good positions, make demands about precedence, and occasionally storm out in offence if they felt insufficiently honoured. The host family had to navigate complex webs of status, alliance, and ancient grudges just to create a seating chart that wouldn't start a feud. Then came the food, and medieval feasts were designed to impress. We're talking swans roasted and redressed in their own feathers, peacocks displayed with tail feathers fanned, whole roasted boars with apples in their mouths, elaborate meat pies that released live birds when cut open, and towering sugar sculptures called subtleties that depicted scenes from romance or mythology. The meal progressed in courses, sometimes a dozen or more for really extravagant occasions. Each course included multiple dishes, roasted meats, fish prepared in various ways, savoury pies, stews, jellies, custards, fruits both fresh and preserved, nuts, cheese, and endless amounts of bread. Servers would parade each course into the hall while musicians played, making the meal itself a form of theatre. Spices were used aggressively. Medieval cooks loved strong flavours, partially to preserve food, partially to demonstrate wealth since spices were expensive, and partially because subtle seasoning wasn't really their style. Dishes were heavily spiced with pepper, cinnamon, ginger, cloves, and saffron. Everything tasted intensely flavoured, sometimes overwhelmingly so. The truly wealthy served exotic foods to show off their international connections, imported Mediterranean fruits, expensive fish from distant waters, game birds that required special hunting licenses, and delicacies that most guests had never tasted before. The point was conspicuous. Consumption. Look how much we can afford to spend on this one meal. Peasant wedding feasts were considerably humbler, but still important community events. The menu might include roasted chicken or pork, bread, cheese, pottage, a thick vegetable stew, ale or cider, and maybe some simple pastries or fritters if the family was feeling festive. The quantities were generous, but the variety limited by what was locally available and affordable. Regardless of social class, alcohol flowed freely. Medieval people drank a lot under normal circumstances, and weddings were special occasions that justified even more drinking. Ale for the common folk, wine for the wealthy, sometimes mead or cider depending on the region. Toasts were constant, drinking games common, and by the end of the evening, a significant portion of the guests would be thoroughly drunk. This leads to inevitable problems. Drunken guests got into arguments, sometimes escalating to fistfights. Old family disputes resurfaced after enough wine. Romantic entanglements developed between people who definitely weren't married to each other. The combination of alcohol, social mixing, and relaxed supervision made wedding feasts notorious for bad behavior. Entertainment helped keep things from degenerating into complete chaos. Musicians played throughout the meal, providing background music and occasionally performing specific pieces requested by the hosts. Popular instruments included lutes, harps, pipes, drums, and whatever else the musicians could carry. Between courses, additional entertainment filled the gaps. Jugglers, acrobats, trained animals, jesters, and storytellers all performed at wealthy weddings. The quality varied wildly. Sometimes you'd get genuinely talented performers. Other times you'd get a guy who claimed his dog could dance, but the dog mainly just barked and bit people. Dancing was expected, particularly as the evening progressed and people got drunker. Medieval dances were communal, affairs, circle dances and line dances where everyone participated. There were also couple dances, which gave young people rare opportunities for physical closeness under socially acceptable circumstances. Chaperones watched carefully, but things still happened. Gift-giving occurred during the feast. Guests were expected to bring presents, usually items for the new household, linens, cooking pots, tools, sometimes livestock or small amounts of money. The bride and groom's families also exchanged gifts, both to demonstrate generosity and to fulfill contractual obligations. Everything was carefully noted because medieval people kept detailed records of who gave what. The bride would sometimes distribute small tokens to guests as favours, ribbons, gloves, or bits of her wedding attire. This was considered lucky, and guests would compete for these items. In some regions, young women would try to grab pieces of the bride's dress for good fortune, which occasionally resulted in the dress being literally torn apart by eager well-wishers. As the feast continued, things got increasingly rowdy. Songs became bawdier, jokes more explicit, and the general atmosphere less refined. This was expected and even encouraged. A reserved, quiet wedding feast was considered a bad omen. You wanted noise, laughter, and celebration, even if it got a bit out of hand. Eventually the feast would wind down, though this could take hours. Guests would begin leaving, though close family and friends might stay overnight. The bride and groom, however, weren't done yet, not even close, because the most awkward part of the entire medieval wedding experience was still ahead: the bedding ceremony. Chapter 5. The bedding ceremony, the part you really wouldn't survive. Okay, deep breath. We've reached the bedding ceremony, which is exactly what it sounds like, and somehow even worse than you're imagining. In medieval Europe, particularly among nobility, the wedding night wasn't a private affair between two newlyweds. It was a witnessed, publicly verified event designed to ensure the marriage was properly consummated and therefore legally binding. Let's start with the basics. Consummation, the physical completion of the marriage act, was legally required for a marriage to be considered complete and indissoluble. An unconsummated marriage could be annulled relatively easily. A consummated marriage was permanent, at least in theory. So families had a vested interest in making absolutely certain consummation happened. Enter the bedding ceremony, where privacy and dignity went to die. The process began after the wedding feast, once the celebrating had reached peak rowdiness. The bride would be escorted to the bedchamber by a group of women, usually married female relatives and friends. They would help her undress, change into her nightclothes, and prepare for bed. This wasn't a quick process. Medieval clothing involved multiple layers, complicated lacings, and enough pins to make undressing a genuine challenge. Meanwhile, the groom underwent similar treatment from the men, who would escort him to the chamber with much backslapping, terrible advice, and bawdy jokes. Everyone was drinking heavily, which helped with nerves but didn't help with dignity. Once both parties were suitably undressed and anxious, they'd be led to the marriage bed. In noble households, this was often a special bed prepared specifically for the occasion, blessed by a priest and decorated with flowers and herbs meant to encourage fertility. Here's where it gets really uncomfortable. The couple would get into bed together while guests crowded into the chamber. Yes, witnesses actually entered the bedchamber. Depending on local custom and the importance of the marriage, anywhere from a handful to dozens of people might cram in to witness the couple getting into bed together. The priest, if one was present, would bless the bed and the couple. This blessing was surprisingly explicit, asking God to grant fertility, healthy children, and mutual satisfaction. Medieval priests did not shy away from the physical realities of marriage in their prayers. Then came the really invasive part. In some regions, particularly for high-stakes political marriages, witnesses would literally stay in the room to verify consummation. They might stand behind curtains or screens, or in some extreme cases, remain visible in the room. The couple was expected to perform their marital duties while these witnesses waited for evidence. That evidence usually meant sounds, movement of the bed, or in some cases the bride's cry of pain if she was a virgin. Witnesses would then testify that they'd heard or observed proof of consummation. For royal marriages, this testimony could be documented in official records and used later to prevent annulments. The morning after brought its own rituals. In many cultures, the bride's virginity needed to be proven via the notorious blood-stained sheet. Servants or family members would examine the bedding for blood, which supposedly confirmed the bride had been a virgin. If blood was found, it might be displayed publicly, or at least shown to key witnesses. If no blood appeared, problems arose. The bride could be accused of not being a virgin, which could void the marriage contract and return her to her family in disgrace. Her reputation would be destroyed, and her family might have to return the dowry. Some families, knowing this, prepared backup plans: chicken blood, strategic cuts, anything to produce the required stain. The medical reality that not all virgins bleed during first intercourse was either unknown or deliberately ignored. The bleeding sheet had become such an entrenched tradition that facts didn't matter. Social expectation and contractual requirements trumped biology. For the groom, performance anxiety must have been astronomical. Imagine trying to perform intimately with your brand new spouse, whom you may have just met, while drunk, exhausted from days of celebration, and knowing that witnesses are literally waiting for evidence. Some grooms couldn't manage it, leading to embarrassment, accusations of impotence, and sometimes annulment proceedings. The morning gift mentioned earlier was presented after successful consummation. This was property or money the groom gave to the bride, essentially compensation for her virginity and confirmation of the marriage. The gift was legally hers, providing some financial security if she became a widow. Receiving the morning gift publicly confirmed that the marriage had been consummated. Peasant bedding ceremonies were less formal but still public affairs. The community would escort the couple to their home, make bawdy jokes, bang pots and pans outside the window, and generally ensure everyone knew what was expected to happen. There might not be formal witnesses in the room, but but the entire village would be keeping track. Charivari, or rough music, was a folk tradition where communities would make noise outside newlyweds' homes on the wedding night. This served multiple purposes. It announced the marriage to the community, it was supposed to bring good luck, and it made the couple's attempts at privacy nearly impossible. Some communities kept up the noise for hours or even days. For couples who actually liked each other, all of this must have been mortifying. Your most intimate moment, surrounded by drunk relatives offering advice, servants preparing to examine linens, and community expectations weighing on every action. Not exactly the romantic wedding night depicted in fairy tales. For couples who didn't know each other well, which was most medieval marriages, it was even worse. You're expected to be intimate with essentially a stranger while dealing with all the pressure, publicity, and performance requirements. Some marriages started with genuine trauma from these experiences. The church had complicated feelings about all this. On one hand, consummation was theologically necessary for marriage completion. On the other hand, the voyeuristic aspects of bedding ceremonies made clergy uncomfortable. Some theologians argued that witnesses shouldn't be allowed in the actual bedchamber, but this advice was widely ignored when important inheritances were at stake. Royal bedding ceremonies were documented in detail. When King Henry VII of England married Elizabeth of York in 1486, the bedding ceremony was witnessed by high-ranking nobles and church officials who later swore that consummation had occurred. This testimony was important for legitimizing their children's claim to the throne. Sometimes couples refused to consummate the marriage immediately, for various reasons: illness, exhaustion, second thoughts, or simple human decency. This could cause legal complications. If too much time passed, people might question whether consummation ever happened, potentially invalidating the marriage later. Annulments based on non-consummation were not uncommon, particularly among nobility who decided a marriage wasn't politically useful anymore. If you could prove the marriage had never been consummated, you could get it dissolved and try again with someone more advantageous. This led to complicated legal battles where former spouses would argue about whether consummation had occurred years earlier. The entire bedding ceremony tradition reflected medieval attitudes toward marriage. It was a public contract, not a private relationship. The community, the families, the church all had interests in ensuring the marriage was valid and productive. Individual comfort and privacy were secondary concerns at best. By the late medieval period, some of these practices were becoming less common, at least among educated urban populations who considered public bedding ceremonies barbaric. But in rural areas, and among traditional nobility, the customs persisted well into the early modern period. So yes, if you thought modern weddings were stressful, imagine your wedding night being a spectator sport with legal implications and your bed sheets subject to public inspection. Medieval marriage was many things, but private definitely wasn't one of them. Chapter 6. Marriage Ages and Child Brides. The uncomfortable reality. Let's address one of the most uncomfortable aspects of medieval marriage: age. Because while we've mentioned that betrothals could happen in childhood, we need to talk about when marriages were actually consummated and what that meant for young people, particularly young girls in medieval society. Canon law set minimum marriage ages at 12 for girls and 14 for boys. These ages weren't arbitrary, they were based on medieval understanding of puberty and the physical capability to consummate marriage. The Church considered these the ages of consent, when young people could legally agree to marriage and fulfill its physical requirements. In practice, marriage ages varied considerably by social class and region. Among peasants, marriages typically occurred in the late teens or early 20s. Economic realities dictated this. You needed to be old enough to run a household, work productively, and support a family. Marrying off a 15-year-old daughter when she was still learning to manage a home and hadn't accumulated any dowry made little practical sense. Nobility was a different story. Political marriages could and did happen at the minimum legal ages, sometimes younger. 12-year-old brides. Marrying 14-year-old grooms wasn't uncommon among the aristocracy when alliances were urgent and heirs needed to be secured quickly. Margaret Beaufort, mother of King Henry VII, was married at age 12 and gave birth at 13. This wasn't celebrated as normal even by medieval standards. It was considered dangerous and unfortunate. Margaret suffered physical complications from the early pregnancy and never had another child. Her case illustrates that while such marriages were legal, they were recognised as risky. Some royal marriages involved even younger children. Isabella of Valois was 6 years old when she married Richard II of England, who was 29. This was purely political, and the marriage wasn't consummated until she was older, if ever. Richard died before Isabella reached puberty, and she later remarried. But the fact that such a marriage could be legally contracted at all shows how little childhood was protected when politics intervened. The Church tried to discourage marriages before the legal minimum age. Technically, such marriages were invalid and could be annulled, but powerful families often ignored these rules, particularly if the political situation demanded immediate alliance. The marriage would be contracted, but consummation delayed until the bride reached 12, at which point the marriage became legally complete. This created a strange limbo state. You could be married, but not really married, living with your spouse's family, but unable to fulfill marital obligations. For young girls, this often meant becoming essentially unpaid labour in their husband's household, while waiting to be old enough for the marriage to be finalised. Medical understanding of puberty was limited. Medieval physicians knew that physical maturation happened, but they didn't understand the biological process clearly. Starting menstruation was taken as proof a girl was ready for marriage and childbearing, regardless of actual physical development or emotional maturity. The reality is that most human bodies aren't fully ready for childbearing at 12, even if menstruation has started. Medieval women who married and became pregnant very young faced significantly higher mortality rates during childbirth. This was known empirically. Families knew that young mothers were more likely to die. But political necessity often overrode maternal safety. Some regions had traditions that delayed consummation even after the legal age. A couple might marry but continue living separately for a year or more, giving the bride time to mature physically and prepare for household management. This was more common among merchant families who balanced political alliance needs with practical concerns about their daughter's well-being. But let's be clear, the minimum age of 12 for girls was shockingly low by modern standards, and it resulted in genuine suffering. Young girls were married to adult men, expected to manage households they weren't, prepared for and pressured into pregnancy before their bodies were ready. Some adapted and survived, others didn't. The mortality rate for mothers in their early teens was significantly higher than for women in their 20s. Complications from childbirth, including obstructed labour, bleeding and infection, killed young mothers at alarming rates. But because these marriages secured alliances, transferred property, and fulfilled political obligations, they continued. Consent was complicated at these ages. A 12-year-old could legally consent to marriage according to church law, but how meaningful was that consent when the decision was made by parents, enforced by social pressure, and backed by legal obligation? Most young brides had little real choice in the matter. Some young people did resist. Records exist of teenage brides refusing to go through with marriages, running away, or declaring before church officials that they'd been forced. These cases were rare, but demonstrate that not all young people passively accepted their fates. However, Successfully resisting parental pressure required courage, legal knowledge, and usually support from someone with authority, all of which were scarce for teenage girls. Boys had slightly more flexibility due to the higher minimum age and social expectations that grooms be established enough to support a household. A 14-year-old groom was legally marriageable, but might wait several years before actually marrying if his family didn't have urgent political needs. Young noblemen often married older than the minimum age, sometimes into their 20s. The double standard was obvious. A noble family might be happy to marry their 12-year-old daughter to a political ally, but wait to marry their 15-year-old son until he'd completed his education and training. Daughters were assets to be deployed. Sons were investments to be cultivated. Not all cultures within medieval Europe followed the same patterns. In Scandinavia, marriage ages tended to be higher, with most people marrying in their late teens or 20s. Mediterranean regions saw younger marriages, particularly in southern Italy and Iberia, where Islamic influence had affected local customs. The Orthodox Christian East had similar age minimums, but different enforcement. Byzantine marriages could happen young among nobility, but common folk generally married later. Jewish communities in medieval Europe typically married daughters at slightly older ages than their Christian neighbours, often around 14 to 16, balancing religious law with community welfare concerns. As the medieval period progressed into the Renaissance, attitudes began shifting slowly. Humanist thinkers started questioning whether 12 was truly an appropriate age for marriage, suggesting that emotional and intellectual maturity mattered as much as physical capability. But legal changes came very slowly, and traditional practices persisted in rural areas well into the modern era. The uncomfortable truth is that medieval marriage practices regarding age reflected a society that valued property, alliance, and inheritance over individual welfare and childhood protection. Young people, especially young girls, were married off at ages we'd now consider child abuse, and they suffered for it physically, emotionally, and psychologically. Understanding this history doesn't mean excusing it or relativizing it as different times. It means recognizing that institutional marriage has often failed to protect the most vulnerable, and that the concept of childhood as a protected period of development is historically recent and worth defending. Chapter 7. Arranged Marriages, when love was optional and alliances were forever. If you've been paying attention so far, you've probably noticed a theme. Medieval marriage was rarely about love. It was about alliances, property, inheritance, and sometimes just avoiding warfare. Now let's dive deeper into how arranged marriages actually worked and what life was like when your spouse was chosen by people who'd never asked you what you wanted. Among nobility, arranged marriages were universal. You didn't marry for love, you married to strengthen your family's political position. Your preferences mattered about as much as your opinion on which horse to buy, which is to say, not at all. The decision was made by parents, guardians, or if you were really unlucky, by your king who needed to shore up an alliance, and you were the convenient pawn. The process started with negotiations between families. Let's say you're a noble family with a marriageable daughter. You'd identify potential matches among families of equal or higher status, who might offer advantageous connections. Maybe they control important trade routes. Maybe they're close to the king. Maybe they just have a lot of money and you need some. Ambassadors or intermediaries would make initial contact. These weren't casual conversations. They were formal diplomatic negotiations where everything was coded and subtle. "We've noticed your eldest son is unmarried" was an opening bid. The response would indicate interest or polite deflection. If both sides were interested, formal negotiations began. Intelligence gathering was crucial. Before agreeing to a match, families investigated each other thoroughly. What were their finances really like? Did they have hidden debts? How was their reputation? Were there health problems in the bloodline? Any scandals that could reflect poorly on your family? Medieval noble families employed networks of informants who'd report back on potential matches. Sometimes families flat out lied. They'd exaggerate their wealth, hide their debts, or fail to mention that the proposed groom had already fathered 3 illegitimate children with a merchant's daughter. When the truth emerged after the marriage, it could lead to lawsuits, annulments, or, occasionally, actual warfare. The betrothed parties usually met before marriage, but not always. Some brides met their husbands for the first time at the wedding ceremony. Others had brief, heavily chaperoned meetings where they exchanged maybe a dozen words while both sets of parents watched critically. You could not get to know someone under these conditions, which was kind of the point. Love might develop later, but it wasn't part of the initial calculation. Portrait exchanges became common for long-distance arrangements. If a prince in France was considering marriage to a princess in England, portraits would be commissioned and sent back and forth. These portraits were notoriously unreliable. Court painters were hired to make subjects look as attractive as possible, and they took considerable artistic license. More than one groom arrived for his wedding to discover his bride looked nothing like her portrait. King Henry VIII famously fell victim to this when he married Anne of Cleves based on a flattering portrait by Hans Holbein. When Anne arrived in England, Henry was reportedly dismayed by her appearance and called her a Flanders mare. The marriage was annulled within months. Portrait deception was a known risk of arranged marriage. For the actual betrothed individuals, the powerlessness must have been crushing. You had no say in choosing your spouse, no ability to refuse unless you had extraordinary courage and support, and your entire future was being decided by people prioritizing politics over your happiness. Some young people tried to take control anyway. Elopements happened, though they were scandalous, and often resulted in disinheritance. If a noble daughter ran off with someone she actually loved, her family might disown her entirely, cut off her inheritance, and refuse to acknowledge the marriage. The couple would face social ostracism and financial hardship. But some did it anyway, choosing love and poverty over an arranged marriage to someone they couldn't stand. The Church's position on consent created a loophole. Since valid marriage required consent from both parties, a determined young person could theoretically refuse. But actually exercising this right against parental pressure was nearly impossible. Parents had numerous tools of coercion: emotional manipulation, threats, physical confinement, or simply wearing down resistance over months or years. Some noble families imprisoned their daughters until they agreed to marry. This wasn't metaphorical imprisonment. Young women were locked in rooms, denied visitors, and subjected to constant pressure from family members until they consented. Once they'd formally agreed, even under duress, the marriage could proceed, and later annulment became very difficult. For royal families, arranged marriages were instruments of foreign policy. A princess wasn't a person. She was a diplomatic asset. She'd be sent to another country, often never to see her family again, to marry a man she'd never met and cement an alliance her father needed. Her feelings were irrelevant. Catherine of Aragon was betrothed to Arthur, Prince of Wales, when she was 3 years old. She was sent from Spain to England as a teenager to marry a young man she'd never met. When Arthur died months later, she was trapped in England, caught between Spanish and English politics, eventually married off to Arthur's younger brother Henry, who later annulled the marriage after 24 years. Her entire life was determined by arranged marriages and political necessity. Men had slightly more agency, but still faced enormous pressure to accept arranged matches. A noble son who refused a politically important marriage could be disinherited, cut off from his family, or in extreme cases, imprisoned or sent to a monastery. The pressure to comply was intense for everyone. Some arranged marriages worked out surprisingly well. Couples grew to respect each other, developed partnerships, and sometimes even fell in love. Shared experiences, raising children, managing estates, and navigating politics together could create genuine bonds. Many medieval nobles seem to have functional, even affectionate marriages despite the arranged nature. Others were disasters. Couples who despised each other had to remain married because divorce wasn't an option and annulment was difficult. They'd live separately when possible, take lovers discreetly, and generally make each other miserable. Medieval literature is full of unhappy marriage stories because unhappy marriages were extremely common. The merchant class imitated noble practices but with slightly more flexibility. A merchant family might arrange their daughter's marriage to another merchant family to create business partnerships, but they generally consider the daughter's opinion. If she absolutely refused, they might look for another match. The stakes weren't as high as with nobility, so there was marginally more room for individual preference. Peasant marriages were least likely to be heavily arranged. Parents influenced the decision, and community expectations mattered. But most peasant couples had some say in choosing their spouses. You'd typically marry someone from your village, someone you'd known for years. Your parents might push you toward one person over another, but outright forcing marriages was less common when there was no property empire to manage. That said, peasant families still arranged marriages for practical reasons. If your daughter could marry the son of a farmer with more land, you'd encourage that match. If your son could marry into a family with useful trade connections, you'd push for it. Economic considerations always mattered. The tragedy of arranged marriage wasn't just the lack of love, though that was part of it. It was the complete subordination of individual will to family interest. You existed to serve your family's needs. Your happiness, preferences, and desires were secondary to property consolidation and alliance building. Some medieval writers recognized this and critiqued it. Romance literature from the period is full of lovers who defy arranged marriages to be together, suggesting that even medieval audiences found the practice problematic. But critique in literature didn't translate to change in practice. Arranged marriages continued because they were too useful to the families and institutions that benefited from them. Chapter 8. Wedding Costs and Bankruptcy. When celebration meant financial ruin. Let's talk about the elephant in the Great Hall. Medieval weddings were ruinously expensive. If you think modern weddings are costly, imagine throwing a multi-day feast for hundreds of guests with no credit cards, no catering companies, and a social obligation to impress everyone or risk your family's reputation. Welcome to medieval wedding economics, where going into debt for your child's wedding was not just common, it was practically mandatory. For noble families, weddings were opportunities to display wealth and power. The goal wasn't to have a nice ceremony, it was to prove you were so rich you could afford to waste staggering amounts of money on a party. Conspicuous consumption was the entire point. If you weren't bankrupting yourself on your daughter's wedding, were you even trying? Let's break down the costs. First, there was the feast. We've already covered this, but let's quantify it. A major noble wedding might feed 500 to 1,000 guests over multiple days. Each person expected multiple courses, quality meat, expensive spices, wine in abundance, and elaborate desserts. The food costs alone could equal years of estate revenue. Then add the serving staff needed to prepare and serve all this food. You'd hire dozens of extra cooks, servers, and kitchen workers. Many estates temporarily employed additional staff just for the wedding, paying them wages and feeding them too. The logistics of feeding 1,000 people medieval style required an army of workers. Entertainment costs mounted quickly. Musicians, performers, actors, jugglers all charged fees. Quality performers demanded high payment, and you needed enough of them to keep guests entertained for hours or days. Some noble weddings hired multiple troupes of musicians, so music played continuously throughout the celebration. Decorations and pageantry added more expense. Great halls would be hung with expensive tapestries, sometimes borrowed or rented at considerable cost. Flowers, candles, and elaborate table settings required purchasing or producing vast quantities of materials. Some families commissioned special banners, flags, and decorative elements, featuring both families' coats of arms. Gifts were another major expense. The families hosting the wedding were expected to give generous gifts to important guests. These might include jewellery, fine cloth, horses, weapons, or valuable household items. For a major wedding, the gift budget could rival the feast budget. The bride's trousseau, her collection of clothing and household items she'd bring to her marriage, represented a huge investment. Wealthy families spent months preparing elaborate wardrobes for their daughters, multiple dresses in expensive fabrics, jewellery, linens, and all the material goods a noble household required. Some families bankrupted themselves providing appropriate trousseaux. Then there was the dowry itself, which we've mentioned but deserves deeper examination. Dowries could include cash, land, revenue rights, trade privileges, and property. For a major noble marriage, a dowry might include entire estates worth decades of income. Families sometimes had to mortgage property or take loans to assemble adequate dowries. Tournament costs for really elaborate weddings added another layer of expense. Some noble weddings included tournaments where knights competed in jousting and other martial contests. Organising a tournament meant preparing the lists, providing prizes, hiring judges and heralds, and feeding and housing participating knights. These could cost fortunes. Lodging guests created additional burdens. Important guests expected to be housed and fed throughout their stay, which could last days or weeks. If your estate couldn't accommodate everyone, you had to pay for lodging at nearby properties or monasteries. Some families housed hundreds of guests for weeks surrounding the wedding. The result of all this spending was that major weddings regularly drove families into debt. Records survive of noble families taking out loans, mortgaging properties, and selling off assets to pay for children's weddings. Some families never fully recovered financially from the cost of marrying off their children. Kings sometimes intervened to limit wedding expenditure. In 1294, England's King Edward I issued sumptuary laws restricting wedding costs to prevent noble families from bankrupting themselves. These laws were largely ignored because no family wanted to look cheap at their child's wedding. The pressure to spend lavishly created a competitive dynamic. If the Smith family threw an elaborate wedding last year, the Jones family couldn't afford to look less impressive this year. Families escalated spending to maintain social position, creating an arms race of wedding extravagance. Some families spread wedding costs over multiple events. The betrothal might have its own celebration, then the wedding ceremony, then additional feasts at various intervals. This distributed the financial burden across more time, but also multiplied the total expense. For merchant families, weddings were also expensive, but in different ways. Merchants needed to project success to maintain business relationships, so they'd host impressive weddings, but with less emphasis on aristocratic pageantry. The focus might be on quality food and generous gifts to important business contacts, rather than tournaments and heraldic display. Peasant families also felt financial pressure around weddings, though on a smaller scale. A peasant wedding feast might include the extended family and village community, perhaps 50 to 100 people. The family would slaughter their best animals, brew ale, and prepare as impressive a meal as they could afford. For a family living close to subsistence, this represented a significant sacrifice. The bride's dowry among peasants was usually modest, some household goods, perhaps a small amount of cash or livestock, and contributions from both families to help the young couple start their household. But even modest dowries strained peasant family budgets. Saving enough to marry off multiple children could take years. Communities sometimes helped. In some villages, neighbours would contribute food, labour, or small gifts to help families host wedding celebrations. This community support system helped distribute the cost and ensured even poor families could celebrate marriages appropriately. But the financial pressure caused problems. Some families went into debt to village moneylenders or local merchants. Repaying these debts could take years, and interest rates were often high. A wedding celebration could burden a family with debt that affected their economic status for a generation. Marriages were sometimes delayed because families couldn't afford the wedding. Young couples might wait years to marry while they saved money, or while their parents accumulated resources for the celebration. This practical consideration affected marriage ages and family planning across all social classes. The church criticized excessive wedding spending, seeing it as vanity and waste. Theologians preached that marriage was a sacred bond that didn't require lavish celebration. Some church councils tried to restrict wedding expenditure, requiring simpler ceremonies. These efforts largely failed because social pressure overwhelmed religious guidance. Wealthy families ignored church criticism because weddings served crucial social and political functions. The display of wealth at weddings reinforced social hierarchies, demonstrated family power, and created obligations among guests who'd received hospitality. The money wasn't wasted from the family's perspective. It was invested in social capital. Some families even used weddings strategically to bankrupt rivals. If you could force a rival family to match your extravagant wedding spending, you might push them into financial difficulty. Social competition was weaponized through conspicuous consumption. The economics of medieval weddings reflected broader social values. Appearance mattered more than financial prudence. Social status was worth going into debt to maintain, and individual financial well-being was secondary to family honour. These weren't values unique to weddings. They pervaded medieval aristocratic culture. Modern wedding industry complaints about costs pale compared to medieval wedding economics. At least today you can choose to have a small wedding without losing social status. In medieval times, a modest wedding for a noble family was essentially admitting poverty and failure. The social pressure to spend was overwhelming and often financially devastating. Chapter 9. Consummation Politics and Annulments. When your marriage became everyone's business. We've already covered the bedding ceremony and its invasive nature, but we need to go deeper into why consummation mattered so much legally and politically. Because in medieval Europe, whether or not a married couple actually had intimate relations wasn't just their business. It was a matter of legal importance, inheritance law, and sometimes international politics. The fundamental issue was this: an unconsummated marriage could be annulled. Not divorced, annulled, meaning it was declared invalid as if it never existed. This was one of the few ways out of marriage in a society where divorce was forbidden, so proving or disproving consummation became crucial in legal disputes. For noble families, consummation determined whether children would be legitimate and whether property transfers were final. If a husband died shortly after marriage, his widow's rights depended partly on whether the marriage had been consummated. Her dower rights, inheritance claims, and social status all hinged on this question. This created perverse incentives. If a family decided a marriage was politically inconvenient, they might claim it was never consummated, even if it was. Conversely, families might insist consummation occurred even if it hadn't, to prevent annulment. Witnesses from the bedding ceremony became crucial evidence in these disputes. Church courts handled annulment cases, and they had to investigate intimate details of couples' lives. Did the couple sleep in the same bed? Were there servants who witnessed evidence of marital relations? Did the couple produce children? All of this became part of court proceedings, with testimony taken from servants, family members, and anyone else who might have relevant information. The standards of proof varied. For royal marriages, written testimony from bedding ceremony witnesses might be preserved in official records. For lesser nobility, proof might depend on gossip, circumstantial evidence, and conflicting testimonies from people with vested interests in the outcome. One famous case involved Eleanor of Aquitaine's first marriage to King Louis VII of France. After 15 years of marriage and 2 daughters, the marriage was annulled on grounds of consanguinity. They were too closely related. But consummation wasn't disputed. They'd clearly had children. This shows that annulment didn't always depend on non-consummation, but it was the easiest path if it could be proven. More scandalous were cases where one party claimed the marriage had never been consummated, despite years together. These claims often arose when a more advantageous marriage prospect appeared. A nobleman might suddenly remember his marriage had never been properly completed, conveniently coinciding with an opportunity to marry an heiress. Women occasionally claimed non-consummation to escape unwanted marriages. If a woman could convince a church court that her husband had never consummated the marriage, she could obtain an annulment and potentially remarry. This required courage because she'd be examined by church officials and midwives to verify her claims, and if found lying, she'd face serious consequences. Impotence claims were another avenue for annulment. If a husband couldn't perform his marital duties, the marriage could be declared invalid. These cases required the husband to submit to examination, which was humiliating and invasive. Medieval physicians would assess whether the man was capable of intercourse, sometimes involving truly bizarre procedures. One particularly unpleasant aspect was the trial by Congress, where in disputed impotence cases, the couple might be ordered to attempt intercourse in front of witnesses or medical examiners. This actually happened in some medieval and early modern courts. The couple would be given a private room but with examiners nearby, or listening for evidence of success. It was dehumanizing and traumatic. False claims of impotence were strategic tools. A wife who wanted out of a marriage might claim her husband was impotent even if he wasn't, betting he'd be too humiliated to fight the claim vigorously. Husbands who wanted annulments might pretend to be impotent, hoping the church would dissolve the marriage, then miraculously recover their abilities afterward. Proving consummation could also be important for inheritance. If a nobleman died shortly after marriage without heirs, his family might try to prove the marriage was never consummated to invalidate his widow's dower claims. The widow would fight back, producing evidence that consummation had occurred. These battles could take years. Pregnancy was ultimate proof of consummation, obviously. A pregnant bride couldn't claim the marriage was unconsummated unless she wanted to admit to adultery, which brought its own serious consequences. But in marriages that lasted months or years without pregnancy, questions would arise. The church taught that marriage had 3 purposes: procreation, mutual support, and remedy for lust. If a marriage clearly wasn't fulfilling the procreation purpose, and one party claimed it wasn't fulfilling the remedy for lust purpose either, annulment became possible. Some couples lived in sexless marriages by mutual agreement, often for religious reasons. These marriages were technically valid if both parties had consented originally, even if they later chose celibacy together. But if one spouse wanted out, they could claim the other had refused consummation from the beginning. Royal succession depended on consummation. If a king died without producing an heir, questions about whether his marriage had been consummated could affect who inherited the throne. Entire kingdoms' futures might hang on whether a couple had successfully performed their marital duties. The Catholic Church's complex rules around marriage created numerous grounds for annulment beyond non-consummation: consanguinity, prior betrothal, coercion, lack of proper consent, impediments like existing vows. But non-consummation was usually the easiest to claim, if not necessarily the easiest to prove. Protestant reformers later criticized the Catholic Church's annulment system as corrupt, arguing that wealthy families could buy annulments while common people were stuck in bad marriages. This criticism had merit. Wealthy families with connections to church officials could navigate annulment proceedings much more successfully than peasants. Some annulments were clearly politically motivated. When Henry VIII of England wanted to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, he initially claimed the marriage was invalid because Catherine had been married to his brother Arthur first. This required proving whether Catherine and Arthur's marriage had been consummated. Catherine insisted it hadn't been. Henry's supporters claimed it had. The entire English Reformation partly hinged on this question. For common folk, annulments were rarer and harder to obtain. A peasant couple unhappy in marriage usually had to make it work, because they lacked the legal resources and church connections to pursue annulment. They might separate informally, living apart but still legally married, unable to remarry. The focus on consummation reflected medieval Christianity's complicated relationship with sex. It was simultaneously necessary for valid marriage and somewhat shameful, required for procreation, but condemned when pursued for pleasure. This tension made the intimate details of married life subject to public and ecclesiastical scrutiny in ways that violated any reasonable expectation of privacy. Looking back from our modern perspective, the medieval focus on consummation seems invasive and dehumanizing. But in a world where marriage was primarily a legal and economic institution rather than a romantic partnership, ensuring marriages were properly completed mattered for property law, inheritance rights, and social order. The fact that whether a couple was intimate became a matter for church courts, political negotiations, and public testimony shows how little medieval marriage respected individual privacy or dignity. Your most intimate moments could become legal evidence in future disputes, examined by strangers with institutional interests in the outcome. Chapter 10. Widowhood and Remarriage, When Death Made You Valuable Again. Death was a constant companion in medieval life, and marriage often ended not with annulment or separation, but with the death of one spouse. This brings us to widowhood and remarriage, which had their own complex rules, economic implications, and social expectations. Because in medieval society, becoming a widow or widower didn't just mean grieving, it meant navigating a new legal status with specific rights and restrictions. Let's start with widows, who had a particularly complicated situation. A widow's status and rights depended heavily on whether her marriage had been consummated, whether she had children, her age, her family's wealth and influence, and local laws that varied wildly across regions. If a marriage had been consummated and the husband had properly assigned dower property, the widow was entitled to support from that dower for the rest of her life. This was her legal right, protected by both church and secular law. The dower typically consisted of 1/3 to 1/2 of her husband's property, providing income and housing. But claiming dower rights and actually receiving them were different things. If her late husband's family wanted to deny her the dower to keep the property intact, they might fight her claims in court. These legal battles could drag on for years, leaving the widow in legal limbo without adequate support. Young widows, especially those without children, were valuable marriage prospects. They'd already proven they could survive marriage. They came with dower rights and often dowry property from their first marriage, and they had years of childbearing ahead. Families would quickly arrange remarriages for young widows before the mourning period barely ended. The church required mourning periods before remarriage, usually about a year. This was partly respect for the dead and partly to ensure any potential pregnancy from the first marriage was resolved before a second marriage complicated inheritance. Widows who remarried too quickly faced criticism for insufficient grief and potential scandal if they gave birth to a child whose father was uncertain. but economic pressure often pushed widows toward quick remarriage. A widow without strong dower protection or family support might desperately need a new husband's financial security. Some widows remarried within months of their husband's death out of economic necessity, facing social censure but needing survival more than approval. Older widows, particularly those who'd raised children and fulfilled their reproductive duties, sometimes chose not to remarry. Widowhood gave women a degree of independence impossible in marriage. A widow controlled her dower property, made her own legal decisions, and wasn't subject to a husband's authority. For some medieval women, widowhood was the first time in their lives they had autonomy. Wealthy, widows could become powerful figures. They managed estates, conducted business, made political alliances, and wielded influence that married women couldn't. Some of the most powerful women in medieval Europe were widows who used their dower property and political connections to shape events. Eleanor of Aquitaine became Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right after her first husband's death, then married King Louis VII of France, got that marriage annulled, then married Henry II of England and became Queen of England. Later, as a widow, she held real power, managing territories and even raising armies. Her widowhood gave her political latitude she'd never had while married. But most widows weren't Eleanor of Aquitaine. Most were ordinary women trying to maintain their households, protect their children's inheritance, and navigate a society that didn't really know what to do with women who weren't under male authority. Peasant widows faced particular hardships. If their husband held land from a lord, the widow might have to pay fees to continue working that land, or the lord might take it back. Some widows lost their homes when their husband's tenancy ended with his death. Without property or income, poor widows often depended on children, family, or charity to survive. The church encouraged widows to remain unmarried and devote themselves to piety. Widows who entered religious life, either as nuns or as vowesses, who took vows of chastity while living in the world, were praised as especially holy. Some widows genuinely wanted this life. Others were pushed into it by families who wanted to control their property. Remarriage options for widows varied by age and social status. A wealthy young widow had numerous suitors. A poor old widow had few. Some widows remarried multiple times over their lives, each marriage changing their legal status and property holdings. Widows were expected to observe mourning customs, wearing black or dark clothing, withdrawing from social life, avoiding festivities. The mourning period was a liminal time when the widow transitioned from one status to another. Breaking mourning customs could result in social censure or even legal problems if her behavior was deemed too unseemly. Now let's talk about widowers, who had a very different experience. Men who lost their wives were encouraged to remarry quickly, especially if they had young children who needed a mother. There was little social stigma around quick remarriage for widowers, and no one questioned whether their grief was sufficient. A widower retained all property from the marriage, including his late wife's dowry if it had been transferred to his control. He also kept custody of children and full authority over the household. Widowhood didn't diminish a man's legal status the way it complicated a woman's. Widowers were attractive marriage prospects, particularly if they had inherited property. A widower with lands, a household, and perhaps children needing care could easily find a new wife, often a younger woman whose family saw benefit in the match. Some widowers remarried within weeks of their wife's death, raising eyebrows but rarely facing serious consequences. The practical argument was that households needed women to manage them, and children needed mothers, so quick remarriage served everyone's interests. Serial marriage was common for both sexes. People routinely married 2, 3, or more times over their lives, as spouses died from disease, childbirth, accidents, or simply old age. Each marriage brought new property arrangements, new family alliances, and new complications. Step-families were everywhere in medieval society. though not talked about in terms we'd recognise. Children from multiple marriages lived together, half-siblings and step-siblings mixing in households where inheritance could be contentious. Stepmothers managing children from their husband's first marriage while protecting their own children's rights created obvious tensions. Inheritance disputes between children of different marriages were common. A man's children from his first marriage might resent property going to children from his second marriage. Wills attempted to address these issues, but often created more disputes. The Church taught that marriage lasted until death, then allowed remarriage. There was no theological problem with remarrying after a spouse died, unlike divorce, which wasn't permitted. So while the Church encouraged widows to remain unmarried for piety's sake, it didn't forbid remarriage. Dower property became complicated with remarriage. If a widow remarried, her dower from her first marriage was supposed to remain hers, but her new husband might gain control of it during the second marriage. When the second husband died, sorting out which property came from which marriage could be legally complex. Some widows remarried men who'd also been married before, creating blended families with children and property from multiple previous marriages. The legal and practical complications were enormous, requiring careful negotiation and clear documentation. Regional customs varied wildly. In some areas, widows automatically lost dower rights if they remarried. In others, they kept dower rights regardless. Some regions required a widow to choose between dower rights and remarriage, essentially penalising remarriage financially. The medieval approach to widowhood and remarriage reflected practical attitudes toward marriage. It was an economic arrangement, and when one party died, new arrangements were made. Grief was expected, but not allowed to interfere with legal and economic necessities. For modern people, used to thinking of marriage as primarily about love and companionship, medieval attitudes toward remarriage seemed cold. Spouses were replaced almost like business partners, with minimal mourning time and maximum focus on property rights and new alliances, but in a world where death was common and survival required economic security, quick remarriage made practical sense even if it lacked emotional sensitivity. Chapter 11. Regional Variations. When Scottish weddings weren't English weddings. So far, we've talked about medieval weddings as if they were uniform across Europe, but that's misleading. Wedding customs, legal requirements, and marriage practices varied enormously by region, culture, and even century. What was true in 13th century England wasn't necessarily true in 14th century Italy or 15th century Poland. Let's explore some of these regional differences, because medieval Europe was diverse, and marriage reflected that diversity. Starting with the British Isles, England, Scotland, Ireland and Wales each had distinct marriage customs, though they shared some commonalities through church influence and political connections. In England, marriage law was relatively standardised through church courts and common law. The requirement for banns, the age minimums, the rules around dower and dowry, these were enforced with reasonable consistency, at least among the nobility and urban populations. Rural areas might be looser in enforcement, but generally followed similar patterns. Scotland, however, had notably different practices, particularly regarding irregular marriage. Scottish law recognised what were called hand-fasting marriages, where a couple could declare themselves married before witnesses without a priest. This was legally valid and binding. The tradition persisted well beyond the medieval period, making Scotland famous for elopements. The phrase "married over the anvil" comes from Scottish border towns like Gretna Green, where blacksmiths would witness marriages for eloping couples from England. This was later, but the tradition of irregular marriage was medieval in origin. Irish marriage customs blended Celtic traditions with Catholic requirements. In Gaelic Ireland, marriages often involved complex negotiations between extended family groups, not just between the immediate families. The role of kin groups in marriage agreements was stronger in Ireland than in England, reflecting different social structures. Welsh marriage customs also preserved pre-Christian elements. While the church controlled formal marriage, folk customs around courtship and betrothal retained distinctly Welsh character. Some regions practiced bundling, where courting couples would sleep in the same bed fully clothed, separated by a board, to spend time together while maintaining propriety. This Scandinavian origin custom found its way into Wales and some other Celtic regions. Moving to continental Europe, France had different customs by region. In the north, marriage practices resembled those in England with strong church control. Southern France, particularly areas influenced by Occitan culture, had traditions of courtly love that affected how marriage was perceived, though not necessarily how it was practiced. The troubadour tradition in southern France celebrated romantic love, often adulterous love, in poetry and song. This created a cultural tension between romantic ideals and the reality of arranged marriage. Young people heard songs about passionate love, then were married off for property consolidation. The disconnect was obvious and occasionally resulted in actual elopements inspired by romantic literature. Germanic regions had their own distinct marriage practices. In the Holy Roman Empire, local custom varied by principality. Some areas retained older Germanic traditions around bride price and morgengabe, the morning gift, which was more prominent than in other regions. The legal complexity of the empire meant marriage law could be different in neighbouring territories. Scandinavia had notably different marriage customs rooted in Norse tradition. While Christianization brought church marriage, Scandinavian weddings retained elements like the bride's crown, the tradition of giving, keys to the new wife symbolizing household authority, and elaborate gift exchanges. Nordic weddings were often negotiated between families like everywhere else, but the cultural emphasis on the bride's honour and the formal transfer of authority had distinct Norse character. Viking-age traditions influenced medieval Scandinavian weddings. The wedding sword presented to the groom, the exchange of family heirlooms, and feasts that could last days. Even after Christianization, these traditions persisted, blended with Catholic ritual. Italy was fragmented into numerous city-states and kingdoms, each with different customs. Northern Italian cities like Florence, Venice, and Genoa had merchant cultures that influenced marriage. Dowries in Italian city-states could be enormous, sometimes comprising the majority of family wealth. Families bankrupted themselves, providing daughters with competitive dowries. Southern Italy and Sicily had different customs influenced by Norman, Arab, and Byzantine traditions. Marriage practices reflected this cultural mixing, with elements that seemed exotic to Northern Europeans. Spain was similarly diverse. Christian kingdoms in the north had marriage customs influenced by Visigothic law and Catholic tradition. The Reconquista, the gradual Christian conquest of Muslim-held Iberia, created regions where Christian, Muslim, and Jewish marriage customs existed side by side. In areas of convivencia, where Christians, Muslims, and Jews lived together, marriage customs sometimes blended. Christian families might adopt wedding feast customs from their Muslim neighbours, while maintaining Catholic ceremony requirements. This cultural exchange, though limited by religious restrictions on intermarriage, still influenced local wedding traditions. Eastern Europe had its own variations. In Poland, Hungary, and Bohemia, marriage customs blended Western Catholic practices with Slavic traditions. The role of extended family in marriage arrangements was often stronger than in Western Europe, reflecting different kinship structures. Orthodox Christian regions like Byzantium and later Russia had different marriage rituals entirely. The Orthodox wedding ceremony was more elaborate than Catholic weddings, with longer rituals, specific vestments, and traditions like the couple being crowned with wreaths. The theological understanding of marriage differed slightly, and divorce was more accessible in Orthodox Christianity than in Catholicism, though still restricted. Byzantine marriages involved extensive negotiations over property, similar to the West, but with different legal frameworks inherited from Roman law. The dowry system worked differently, and women retained more property rights in Byzantine marriage law than in many Western European regions. Across all these regions, social class created variations too. Peasant marriages everywhere were simpler than noble marriages, but the specific folk customs varied by region. A peasant wedding in Bavaria looked different from one in Brittany or Sicily, reflecting local traditions, available resources, and regional cultural norms. Urban marriages differed from rural marriages. City dwellers had more wealth, more literacy, and more access to legal structures. Urban merchants and craftsmen might have elaborate marriage contracts, even though they weren't nobility, because property and business interests required clear documentation. Jewish communities across Europe had their own distinct marriage customs, governed by Jewish law rather than Christian law. The ketubah, the Jewish marriage contract, protected wives' rights and established obligations. Jewish weddings included traditions like the chuppah, the wedding canopy, and the breaking of glass. These customs were maintained despite Christian legal pressure, though Jewish communities still had to navigate Christian legal requirements in some regions. Muslim communities in Iberia before the Reconquista had yet another set of marriage practices, governed by Islamic law. Polygyny was permitted, though not universal. Marriage contracts were detailed and legally binding, and women retained property rights distinct from their husband's control. The clash between Islamic and Christian marriage law in contested regions created legal complexity. Even within single kingdoms, urban and rural customs could differ dramatically. A London merchant's wedding differed from a Yorkshire farmer's wedding in ceremony, cost, legal documentation, and celebration style. Both were English, both were Christian, but local custom and social class created variation. Seasonal patterns varied regionally too. In agricultural regions, weddings clustered in seasons when work was lighter, post-harvest in autumn or early winter before spring planting. In urban areas, economic cycles mattered more than agricultural seasons. Some regions had traditions around specific wedding dates. Marrying during Lent was discouraged everywhere, but some local saints' feast days were considered particularly auspicious for weddings. Regional patron saints' days might see clusters of marriages as couples sought blessing from locally venerated holy figures. The point of all this regional variation is that medieval weddings weren't one uniform thing. They were diverse practices shaped by local tradition, religious culture, social structure, and economic systems. A Scottish irregular marriage, an Italian merchant's elaborate contract, a Scandinavian bride receiving household keys, and a Byzantine crowning ceremony were all medieval weddings, but they looked and functioned very differently. Understanding this diversity matters because it reminds us that medieval marriage is a simplification. The medieval period spanned 1,000 years and a continent of diverse cultures. Marriage practices reflected that diversity, changing over time and varying by place. What we can say is that across all these variations, marriage remained primarily an economic and social institution, arranged by families for property and alliance purposes, with limited room for individual romantic choice. Chapter 12, Conclusion: Why medieval marriage would absolutely destroy you. So we've covered betrothals arranged in childhood, contract negotiations that put modern lawyers to shame, wedding ceremonies that could happen in a barn, feasts expensive enough to bankrupt families, bedding rituals that violated every concept of privacy, consummation politics that made your intimate life public record, and enough regional variation to make your head spin. Now let's wrap this up with why you, a modern person, would absolutely not survive getting married in medieval times. First, and most obviously, you'd have no choice in your spouse. Think about that. The person you'd spend your entire life with, share a household with, potentially have children with, would be chosen by your parents based on political and economic factors you had no say in. You might meet your spouse for the first time at your wedding. You'd have no courtship period to determine compatibility. No dating to see if you actually like each other. Nothing. You'd marry a stranger and hope for the best. Modern people are used to choosing their romantic partners based on attraction, shared interests, compatible personalities, and mutual affection. Medieval people got none of that. You married who your family needed you to marry, and your feelings about it were irrelevant. The psychological strain of living intimately with someone you didn't choose and might not like would be enormous. Second, the complete lack of privacy. Your engagement was public. Your wedding was witnessed by hundreds. Your wedding night was observed by witnesses who verified consummation. The evidence of your virginity or lack thereof was examined by family members. Whether you successfully performed marital duties became legal, record. Every aspect of your marriage was community and family business. Modern people expect privacy in relationships. We consider our intimate lives personal matters. Medieval people had no such expectation. Your marriage existed to serve family and social purposes, so family and society monitored it constantly. The invasion of privacy would be intolerable to anyone raised with modern values. Third, the financial pressure. If you were nobility, your wedding would cost a fortune, potentially bankrupting your family. You'd feel obligated to approve extravagant spending because family honor demanded it. If you were a peasant, your family would sacrifice significantly to provide an adequate dowry and wedding celebration. Either way, enormous financial pressure would surround your marriage from the beginning. Modern weddings are expensive, but couples often have input on budget and can choose modest ceremonies without losing all social standing. Medieval families, especially noble ones, had no such flexibility. The social cost of a modest wedding was too high, forcing families into debt to maintain appearances. Fourth, the sexual expectations and monitoring. You'd be expected to consummate your marriage immediately, probably with witnesses nearby. Your fertility would be monitored and commented on by extended family. If you didn't produce children quickly, especially sons, you'd face social pressure and possible accusations of inadequacy. Your most intimate relationship would be subject to constant external pressure and evaluation. Modern people generally consider sex a private matter between partners. Medieval people treated marital sexuality as a topic of church regulation, family interest, and legal importance. The pressure to perform and reproduce would be overwhelming, especially for women whose value was largely tied to childbearing. Fifth, the gender inequality. If you were a woman, marriage meant legal subordination to your husband. You'd likely lose control of your property, need your husband's permission for most legal actions, and be expected to obey him in all matters. Your legal identity would be essentially absorbed into his. Even your body wouldn't be fully your own. Marital rape wasn't a recognized concept because husbands had rights to their wives' bodies. Medieval marriage law treated women as property that transferred from father to husband. While some women found ways to exercise power and influence, they did so despite the legal system, not because of it. Modern women used to legal equality and bodily autonomy would find medieval marriage status unacceptably restrictive. Sixth, the permanence. Medieval marriage was for life, period. There was no divorce. If your marriage was miserable, if your spouse was cruel, if you were fundamentally incompatible, too bad, you were stuck. Annulment was theoretically possible but difficult to obtain unless you had wealth, connections, and legal grounds. Most people in bad marriages had no exit. Modern people can end marriages that don't work. Divorce is accessible and socially acceptable. Medieval people had no such option. Couples who hated each other sometimes lived separately if they could afford it, but they remained legally married with no chance of finding happiness with someone else. 7th, the political nature of marriage. Your marriage wasn't about you, it was about alliances, property consolidation, and family advancement. You existed to serve your family's interests. Your happiness was at best a secondary concern, at worst irrelevant. You might be married off to prevent a war, to gain access to trade routes, or to merge two estates. Your individual desires didn't matter. Modern people generally expect to marry for love and personal fulfillment. Medieval people married for family interest. The fundamental purpose of marriage was different, and that difference would be psychologically devastating to someone who expected marriage to be about partnership and affection. 8th, the health risks, especially for women. If you were a woman married young, you'd face pregnancy risks before your body was fully developed. Childbirth was the leading cause of death for medieval women of childbearing age. You'd be expected to have multiple pregnancies, each one potentially fatal. Medical care was primitive, infection common, and complications often deadly. Modern women in developed countries have access to prenatal care, safe delivery options, and medical intervention when complications arise. Medieval women had none of this. They faced childbirth with prayer and hope, knowing many women didn't survive. The physical danger of medieval marriage for women cannot be overstated. 9th, the disease environment. Medieval hygiene was poor, medical understanding limited, and infectious disease rampant. Living in close quarters with a spouse and extended household meant constant disease exposure. Plagues swept through periodically, killing indiscriminately. You might marry, have children, and lose half your family to disease before you turned 30. Modern people in developed countries have antibiotics, vaccines, and public health infrastructure that make fatal infectious disease relatively rare. Medieval people had none of these protections. The constant presence of death would overshadow marriage and family life in ways modern people can barely imagine. 10th, the complete lack of modern relationship concepts. Therapy didn't exist. Communication techniques weren't taught. Emotional support and partnership weren't expected in marriage. The very vocabulary of healthy relationships, boundaries, consent in the modern sense, emotional labour, didn't exist. You'd navigate marriage with none of the tools we now consider essential for relationship success. Medieval people who built successful marriages did so through practical partnership, shared work, and sometimes genuine affection that developed over time, but they had no framework for discussing feelings, no concept of equitable emotional labour, no therapeutic resources for resolving conflicts. Marriages worked or didn't, and you dealt with it. The fundamental issue is this: medieval marriage was an entirely different institution than modern marriage. It had different purposes, different rules, different expectations, and different values. Modern people marry for love, partnership, and personal fulfillment. Medieval people married for property, alliance, and procreation. The gap between these worldviews is enormous. If you were transported back to medieval times and forced into a medieval marriage, almost everything you expect from marriage would be absent. Choice of partner, privacy, equality, romance, legal protections, exit options, all gone. You'd be in an arranged union with a stranger, your intimate life monitored by community and family, your legal rights minimal if you were a woman, and your marriage serving purposes that had nothing to do with your happiness. Could you adapt? Maybe some people could. Human beings are remarkably adaptable, and medieval people obviously managed to live through this system. Some found happiness despite the constraints, but for most modern people, the psychological, emotional, and practical challenges would be overwhelming. The lack of choice would be soul-crushing. The invasion of privacy would feel dehumanizing. The gender inequality would be infuriating to anyone raised with modern values about equality. The permanence of an unhappy marriage would create despair. The health risks would be terrifying. And the fundamental mismatch between what we expect from marriage and what medieval marriage offered would create constant cognitive dissonance. That's why you wouldn't survive a medieval wedding, not physically necessarily, though women's mortality from childbirth was very real, but psychologically and emotionally. The institution of medieval marriage was designed for a different world with different values. It served functions we no longer need marriage to serve: property consolidation, alliance building, ensuring legitimate heirs for inheritance. Modern marriage is about companionship, love, and mutual support. Those things sometimes existed in medieval marriage, but they were bonuses, not the point. Understanding this difference helps us appreciate both the progress we've made in how we think about marriage and relationships, and the very real suffering that historical marriage practices caused for people who had no choice but to participate in them. So next time you attend a wedding where the couple clearly loves each other, chose each other freely, and has legal equality and protections, take a moment to appreciate that. Those things are historically recent, hard-won, and absolutely not guaranteed by the institution of marriage itself. They're cultural achievements that required centuries of social change. Medieval weddings were elaborate, ceremonies marking property transfers and alliance formations. Modern weddings celebrate romantic partnerships between equals who chose each other. The difference between those two things is the difference between medieval and modern values about individual autonomy, gender equality, and the purpose of human relationships. And that's why, despite all the fancy ceremonies, elaborate feasts, and historical pageantry, you absolutely wouldn't want to actually get married in medieval times. The Instagram-worthy aesthetic might be appealing, but the lived reality was something else entirely. If you've made it this far, congratulations. You now know more about medieval weddings than you probably wanted to. Make sure you hit that like button, subscribe for more historical content that ruins your romantic notions about the past, and drop a comment about which aspect of medieval marriage seems worse to you. Was it the arranged marriage, the bedding ceremony, the total lack of privacy? Let me know. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video where we'll probably ruin some other historical period you thought was romantic. Until next time,